How to agree or disagree with an author. A guide to analytic reading. This is the final lesson on analytic reading in this playlist, so I encourage you to go back and review the others or to watch them for the first time if you haven't yet. I'm going to summarize what we've learned up to this point quickly and concisely before we agree the lesson on agree or disagree. So what is analytic reading? Analytic reading is a way of reading that goes beyond understanding the main idea and basic information of a text. It involves examining the validity, logic, and quality of an author's arguments, as well as comparing them with other texts and your own experience and knowledge. Analytic reading is not passive. It's an active dialogue between you and the author. You need to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and evaluate evidence. You also need to be fair and respectful and open-minded. Why is analytic reading important? Analytic reading is important because it helps you to develop your critical thinking skills and your reasoning skills while assessing any written text and communicating to others about that text. Love it or hate it. You can expand your knowledge and perspective on discourse, the world, and culture at large. You can appreciate different points of view and arguments and become more open and international-minded. You'll be able to communicate your own opinions and your own arguments clearly, concisely, and persuasively to anyone in the English language. And now to our final section of Part 3, How to Read Any Book Analytically. How to agree or disagree with an author. Before you can agree or disagree with an author, you need to understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. This means you need to identify the main idea or the thesis of the text, identify the supporting ideas or arguments of the text, and then identify the evidence or examples that the author uses to support their ideas or arguments. Identify the purpose or goal of the text, the tone, the attitude. And once you've done all that, then you can start to agree or disagree with the author by following these clear steps. 1, you have to understand before you judge. Don't criticize or reject the author's ideas out of hand before you fully comprehend them. This will embarrass you if you don't actually understand the argument and you're trying to pick apart some misinformed idea. You have to try to reconstruct their arguments in your own words and see if they make sense. You can map or diagram this out if it helps you. If you find something unclear, confusing, or contradictory, you have to try to give the author the benefit of the doubt and look for a possible explanation or interpretations. Don't just assume they've made an egregious error. Look up other people's opinions. Are there other criticisms, pre-existing accounts, reflections, reviews? This is how the peer system works. 2, you got to be consistent. Don't agree or disagree with the author selectively or arbitrarily. You need to have a clear and coherent reason for your agreement or your disagreement. You also need to be consistent with your own principles and values. If you agree or disagree with one author on a certain issue, you should apply the same criteria to other authors on the same issue. Okay, so consistent in your criticism across the board is key. 3rd, you need to be relevant. Don't agree or disagree with the author on irrelevant or trivial matters. So this is the sort of like low-hanging fruit, picking up the crumbs under the table thing, okay? If the author has a main argument and it's clearly stated and explicit and at the forefront, that's where you need to meet them head on. You can't go willy-nilly picking at the margins of the book and saying, okay, this is why it doesn't make sense. This is why it doesn't hold its weight. This is why we should completely dump it out. That's this classic, baby with the bathwater argument. Avoid that at all costs. You need to focus on the main idea and the essential arguments of the text, and you need to consider the context of the author, the book, the published date, and the audience of the text, as in the original audience. Don't criticize or praise the author for something that's not related to their purpose or goal. Be reasonable. Don't agree or disagree with the author based on emotions, prejudices, or personal preferences. You need to use logic, evidence, and rationality to support your agreement or your disagreement. You also need to acknowledge the limitations and uncertainties of your own knowledge and perspective. None of us ever have the complete picture with finality. Don't claim absolute certainty or authority on a subject that is complex or controversial. In fact, engaging with it alone should be reason to criticize. Examples and exercises to practice these analytic reading skills are many. Here's a couple we can start with. If you're meeting a factual author, this is someone who writes about facts, history, science, geography, hard data, concrete. To agree or disagree with a factual author, you need to check the accuracy, completeness, and relevance of the facts they've presented. You also need to compare their facts with other sources and your own observations if you're in the same field. So, for example, suppose you read a book about ancient Egypt that claims the pyramids were built by aliens. To agree or disagree with this claim, you need to look for evidence that supports or refutes it, such as archaeological findings, historical records, or scientific explanations. But you also need to consider alternative explanations for how the pyramids were built, i.e., by humans, and you need to find evidence to support that counterclaim. So, if you want to do this as an exercise, we'll break it off here. You find a factual text that interests you and identify one claim that you agree or disagree with. Explain why you agree or disagree with it using facts from other secondary sources. Come on back if you're back. If we're moving right through, let's continue on. So, how to agree or disagree with an interpretive author. So this is someone who's channeling something through them, a text, rather than putting out hard factual analysis. An interpretive author writes about meanings, literature, philosophy, art, things of beauty. To agree or disagree with an interpretive author, you need to understand their perspective, assumptions, and methods, some of which may be subjective, but some of which might not be. So you also need to compare their interpretations with other interpretations and your own experience. For example, suppose you read a poem that expresses a pessimistic view of life, a little bit of the haterade. To agree or disagree with this view, you need to understand what the poet's trying to say, how they're saying it, and the sort of technique or the tools used. So their imagery, their symbolism, their tone. You also need to consider other ways of looking at life and how they relate to your own values and beliefs. So here's an exercise. You find a poem, yeah? Make sure it interests you and identify with one idea in that poem. Agree or disagree. You have to take a side. That's part of the analysis. Now explain why you agree or disagree with it using examples from other texts, i.e. other poems or other literary theory and literary analysis. Okay? That's how it's done. Simple, right? I mean, once you explain the steps and break it down into smaller pieces, you're off to the races. So, next, agreeing or disagreeing with a persuasive author. This is someone who writes about opinions such as politics, ethics, or religion, like Sartre, or existentialism, or anybody in a poli-sci department, or they might disagree with this, but anybody in an economics department, which is my educational background. So to agree or disagree with a persuasive author, you need to evaluate their arguments, evidence, and conclusions. You also need to examine their motives, biases, and credibility. So say you read an essay that argues for the legalizing of marijuana. To agree or disagree with this argument, you need to assess the validity, the strengths, the weaknesses, and the relevance of the reasons the authors put forward and the examples they've provided. You also need to consider the consequences, implications, and alternatives of their position. This is essentially policy analysis, which is exactly what I did in graduate school. I don't know if it's recommended, but go nuts, whatever floats your boat. So, as an exercise, find a persuasive text that interests you and identify one argument you agree with or disagree with. Classic pro-con debate. Legalize, keep it illegal. You explain why you agree or disagree with it using logic, evidence, and counter arguments. That's how it's done. Cost benefit, fine. Pick holes in it, fine. Look at the consequences and the outcomes, fine. And most importantly, meet the author head on. Look at what they've presented on the page, on the screen, and then poke some holes in it. It can be fun if you're into it. In conclusion, analytic reading is a skill that can help you to become a better reader, a better thinker, and a better writer. You want to communicate? Be analytic. By learning how to agree or disagree with an author effectively, you deepen your understanding, you broaden your perspective, and you express your opinions and your arguments clearly and persuasively, as I hope I have in this series. Part 4 is coming up soon. Comment below. On to the next video.